Hi guys, today I want to talk about the not so positive aspects of nursing in the US. And perhaps these will be things that you've experienced in the UK as well. I want to give a balanced view of how things go as a nurse in the US. I've talked a lot about the benefits like opportunities to progress and pay progression and things like that. But we have to talk about the things that perhaps are not the best in terms of life in the US as a nurse. And maybe a good example that I can talk about is bias. So I'll introduce myself again. My name is Tapiwa. I'm a registered nurse with over 2 decades of experience. My experience is in sexual health nursing, midwifery, ICU, public health or health visiting, as we call it in the UK, and nursing education. So today I want to talk about the negative experiences that you may have as a nurse in the US. And I don't think they're going to be very dissimilar to what you would experience in the UK, probably very similar. But I just want to give a balanced view, like I said, that yes, it's wonderful being a nurse in the US, in terms of pay, opportunities for progression and all that, but it's not going to come without hurdles. I'll give you some examples. You will still face the same bias that you faced in the UK in terms of how maybe physicians, for example, relate to you. You might bring up a concern. Let's say a patient has one swollen arm, and you know that this arm was not swollen yesterday. Maybe you had the same patient yesterday, and when you had them, their arm maybe wasn't as swollen as it is, and you're concerned. So you bring it up, you use the processes and tools that you have for alerting physicians or notifying physicians about things. And let's say you use the S bar. You tell them the situation. I have this patient who has a swollen arm. This patient has been in for this long with this condition. And I've noticed that this arm is swollen more so than the other one. And then you give, the background, whatever the background is, why the patient is there and all that, your assessment. So you're talking, actual numbers like your vital signs and whatever else assessments you've made of that patient, the current state that they're in, and your recommendation. Maybe you're saying, hey, maybe we should do an ultrasound and see if this patient has a DVT, because if they do have a DVT, that clot can travel and cause a pulmonary embolism or a stroke. So you do all the things you're supposed to do, and you're not taken seriously. And this happens. It's happened to me, and I'm sure it's happened to other nurses of color. So you're not taken seriously. In those instances, what I would encourage you to do is to make sure that your documentation is 100% clear about what it is that you reported, when you reported it, to who you reported it, and what you did to escalate the situation if you felt that it wasn't taken seriously. One, because you need to cover yourself, and two, because you are the patient's biggest advocate. So you need to make sure that you have demonstrated that you advocated for that patient. So in spite of the bias that you're facing, you're still going to be able to do your job. You're still going to do all the things that you need to do to be that patient's advocate. So documentation, escalation, and reporting, I suppose, that look, this is what happened. I wasn't taken seriously. This was the outcome. Hopefully the patient has a good outcome. Hopefully someone along the way will listen and take action and make sure that the patient's needs are taken care of. But, document, 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 and don't give up. If one person won't listen to you, another person will listen to you. So that bias does exist here as well as it does in the UK. And unfortunately, it doesn't just affect you as the nurse, it affects the patient ultimately. The patient has a bigger price to pay than you do. So my advice, I guess, on that is keep being your patient's biggest advocate. Keep doing what you've always done. Use your expertise, do your assessments, escalate concerns, and document, document, document. So before you come, if you're planning on coming to the States, learn to use those tools that are supposed to be used for communication, like SBAR. I know that we used to use SBAR in the UK as well. It is commonly used here in the US as well. So learn to use it, really understand what does SBAR mean and how do I use it to communicate with physicians. Another thing that you might experience, which it depends on how you see it, I suppose, you will get asked a lot about your name. Like if you have a name that is not an English name, you might find that every single person you encounter will say to you, "Oh, where's that from?" Like they'll find a way to ask you about where you're from. And I think people forget that they're not the only person who's asked you that. If they're the third person to ask you that in a day, and trust me, it is a daily occurrence being asked, "Oh, so where?" They'll either ask you directly, "Where are you from?" Or they'll say, "Where did you go to school?" That's another one that I've had. "Where did you go to school?" So that they can try and figure out where you're from based on where you went to school. So people forget that they're not the first person to ask you that. And when you've been asked that for the umpteenth time in a day or in a shift, it gets old really quickly. So I had a patient say to me the other day, she asked me, "Where are you from?" Which, I was fine with. I'm used to it now. I've made the decision that I just have to be okay with being asked that about 10 times a day. And then I immediately told her, and I went very specific. I said, "My name is Tapiwa. I'm from Zimbabwe. I was born in Harare. I studied in the UK," and I went into it just to see how she would react because I could see she was very curious. And then she goes, "Oh, that is all very specific. When you ask other people, they get really upset. And they'll say something really vague like, 'Oh, I'm African,' or 'I'm Asian,' or 'I'm this.'" And I wanted to say to her, "Well, maybe you should think about the fact that you're not the first person to ask them that day. They've probably had that question asked to them a few times already in that day. And they're just trying to do their job, same as someone who's not from Africa or from Asia. They're just trying to do their job. And, it's an added layer for them, which perhaps someone who's American doesn't have to deal with." But I didn't say that. I just said, I just laughed it off. And then I said, "Did you have any other questions about me that you wanted to know?" And then she goes, "Oh, no, 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 no. I'm just glad that you're okay with being asked." And I said, "Yeah, it's who I am. So I have no problem with it." So yeah, that's something that you have to deal with quite a lot. You will be asked a lot about your name if you're African or non-white and have a name that is not known to them, or English, or yeah, you get what I mean. That's a question that you will be asked several times a day. So you can either accept that this is going to be a daily, occurrence. For me, I'm going to be asked every single day, "Where are you from?" Or something to that effect, where people are trying to figure out your nationality or your ethnicity or whatever. They might ask about your accent, or they might say, "Are you Jamaican?" or whatever it is. So yes, I guess that's something that can either be positive or negative. And also it depends on how it is asked. Some people ask purely out of curiosity. Some people ask it because they're trying to figure out if you're competent, they're trying to gauge you or place you on a scale about how competent should they decide that you are, based on where you're from. So if you're from this country or that country, they're going to decide in their heads that surely you're not competent because you're from there or whatever. So yeah, get used to that. That's something that will happen almost on a daily basis. But, if you keep your eye on the ball and know why you're here, it shouldn't be that much of a problem, but it's something to be aware of. So another form of bias that you could face is accent bias, which is probably linked to what I spoke about before, where people are trying to figure out where you're from so they can decide if you're competent. It could either be a patient or your colleagues. Once you open your mouth and they hear an accent and they decide that that accent is different to what they're used to, it's not an American accent. Maybe it's African or Asian or European, they might at that point decide that you are incompetent because you sound different. And so the things you say might be considered less than. And so you have to find a way to demonstrate that, listen, my accent is my accent, but my training is equal to, if not better than what you had, because pathophysiology is the same everywhere, biology is the same everywhere, chemistry, all the lessons that you did to become a nurse are the same everywhere. And many patients and even colleagues who don't know about the process of a nurse coming into the US may not recognize that you also had to pass the NCLEX. So if I can pass the NCLEX same as you did first time, I am as competent as you are. And perhaps I even have more experience than you have, because I've worked in a different healthcare system. I'm navigating a different healthcare system to the one that you are used to. Maybe you only have one frame of reference, the American one. I've got two frames of reference and many more years of experience. And so I'm bringing a lot more to the table than you are. So yes, you can face that form of bias from colleagues, where you open your mouth, they hear an accent, and automatically they think you are less than or you're incompetent because you have an accent. You might even find that, and I've observed this, where even patient care technicians, for example, if you delegate work to them, they're less likely to go and do that work. They'll find an excuse to not do what you've asked them to do because you are foreign. But if a white colleague asks them to do something, they will go and do it because they've decided that you are less than because you're foreign and because you have an accent. And so you may face that. I have to say that for me, it has happened, but I see it more often with other colleagues of mine, where they have an accent which might be even more pronounced than mine is. They will find it really difficult to delegate to people at work, like patient care technicians, who will decide that I'm going to find an excuse to not do that or to not help that person because they have an accent. So yes, those kinds of things happen. Or also, maybe you have a patient who hears your accent and decides that because you have an accent, they're going to switch off. They're not going to listen to anything you have to say because they've decided that you're incompetent. Again, without realizing that it isn't easy to come here and become a nurse. There's a whole process where your educational credentials are thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly, scrutinized to see if they match up with American credentials. And without that, you don't get to even have permission to take the NCLEX. You can only take the NCLEX if they deem your educational credentials to be equal to or more than the American credentials. So, you will face accent bias. You just have to be prepared for that and know that, okay, this might happen, and then decide, if it does happen, what am I going to do about it? It's something that probably is not within your control. All you can control is how you present yourself. Be as professional as you can be, demonstrate just how knowledgeable and experienced you are, and let them decide what they're going to do about that. Because how people behave is something you can't control. You can only control how you behave. And that's not to say that it's easy. It's not easy. It's challenging. It can take a toll on you. It can make you feel really stressed at work. The whole experience of work can become very, very unpleasant, and you can dread going to work because of it. But I find that some places are better than others. Some places have a greater sense of openness and less bias, because they are consciously always looking at themselves and saying, how can we be better colleagues? Because they recognize the need. If the US could staff its own hospitals exclusively with Americans, I'm sure they would, but they can't. And that's why they open their borders to foreigners to come. I've had good and bad experiences. I have one employer that is the workforce there is very, very, very diverse. The patient group is also very, very, very diverse. And just by nature of that, what you'll notice is that people there are so much more conscious of bias and are so much more conscious of how they present themselves to you, whether it's patients or colleagues. And so the experience of working there becomes a very pleasant one, a very pleasant and fulfilling one, because there's just a real sense of togetherness and openness to otherness. They're very open to otherness. And so I love that employer. And as long as they'll have me, I will never, ever leave them. Not all places will be like that. Some places are just better than others. Cultural change is very, very difficult. Some places might want to change their cultures, but changing a culture that's deeply ingrained in a place can be very, very difficult. It takes time, and it also takes a willingness of the majority for that change to happen. So it's just something to be aware of. You will have to deal with that in some places, and decide for yourself, how do I want to deal with this? What do I want to do about it? But like I said, there are so many opportunities. And if one place is not working for you, go to another. You will find you'll find your tribe. You will find your place where people will want you and like you and welcome your experience and love your accent and make every effort they can to learn your name. Like, I have one colleague who's obsessed with learning people's names and pronouncing them correctly. And we laugh a lot about people that want to call me Tapiwa instead of Tapiwa. Um, I feel like sometimes she cares more about people pronouncing my name correctly than I do. But that's very sweet, isn't it? It's very touching, and it's another reason why you just think, well, I love going to work in this place, because people care enough about my name. The same way I learn to pronounce English names, somebody is making the best effort they can to learn my Zimbabwean name. So it's not all bad, but it's something to be aware of. Your accent, your name, your nationality, your ethnicity, your skin color, those will be things that will come up in different ways. And so having an awareness and being prepared to face it is important, in my opinion. I don't know if I can say much more about this topic. I just wanted to share, I guess, some of the things that you may experience that are perhaps not as positive as I've portrayed other things to be. I just wanted to be a bit more balanced about what I talk about, so that it doesn't seem like it's all rosy. It's not all rosy. It's great. It's really, really good in many, many ways, but just be aware that you will have to deal with some of these things. If you're still listening, thank you so much for getting to the end of this video. Um, and if you're watching me for the first time, please like and subscribe. I want to keep making these videos, but I want to make sure that I'm making videos that are impactful and useful and helpful to people. And that's why I don't make too many videos. If I only make videos about things that I feel are important to me and might be important to someone else. So I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.